We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
These ambitious words, spoken on September 12, 1962, would motivate some of America's best engineers, scientists, and pilots to come together and create the Apollo space program. The missions would face many hardships, yet would eventually land a few American men on the moon and create the foundations for modern-day space exploration in our solar system. As tension between the United States and the Soviet Union peaked in the 1950s, people feared that a Cold War would become hot. In October of 1957, the Soviets launched the first satellite to orbit Earth named Sputnik. This small hunk of a technological wonder made the American populace worry that Soviet Russia would become more technologically advanced than the United States, which would make the US sitting ducks if the Soviets decided to attack. These perceived threats from the Russians struck fear into the hearts of world leaders around the globe, and America knew that one step to maintaining technological supremacy was getting to the moon. Work begun on the very first lunar program in 1963. NASA planned on going big for their first launch by preparing measures for a manned mission named Apollo 1. And on January 27, 1967 at 1 p.m., Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee boarded the Apollo 1 test cabin for a practice run of the takeoff procedures. As the mock launch drew on, constant malfunctions were noticed relating to communications and spacecraft controls. And nearly 5 hours in, at 6:20 p.m., Mission Control halted the countdown, leaving the astronauts as the sole occupants of the cabin.
A combination of unfortunate events led to the tragedy that day. The latch to the exit was extremely hard to open, and a fire had ensued due to a mixture of a high concentration of oxygen in the cabin and a loose wire, creating the spark that would eventually kill everyone on board. It was the perfect storm. This was a dark day in the history of NASA and the Apollo missions. The lunar program was falling behind on JFK's goal to get to the moon before the end of the decade, but eventually the entire country had to move past this grim moment and focus on the task at hand. Despite this tragedy, NASA needed to continue with their noble pursuits and quickly make it to the moon. They soon after launched the unmanned mission Apollo 2 on July 5, 1966, which attempted to gather information on how this and future spacecraft would handle the vast expanse of space. This first successful mission would start a chain of missions that would be integral for the moon landing. The missions that followed would be for the purpose of gathering information on the kinds of shuttles that would work best at both maintaining life support systems and making sure the ship could withstand the brutal conditions of outer space. These other missions gave America the revolutionary Saturn V rocket in Apollo 4, and the lunar module that would eventually land on the moon in Apollo 5. Despite our best efforts, these missions weren't completely airtight. The unmanned mission Apollo 6 was intended to test the Saturn V rocket and test translunar injection. Though complications during takeoff prevented it from completing its main goal of lunar injection, it had still entered lunar orbit and the mission was considered a success. The deadline to get to the moon and fulfill JFK's promise was drawing near. The US as a country knew their next missions had to be successful, and on October 11, 1968, America's lunar program reached a turning point in their journey to the moon. On this day, Apollo 7 was launched, sending Walter Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walter Cunningham into orbit around the Earth for nearly 11 days. This sent a shockwave around the world because it was the first time anyone could keep a human in space for such a long amount of time. NASA realized they were ahead of the game with this mission, and they were now confident they could get to the moon before the end of the decade.
Their next mission, Apollo 8, was intended to be another simple Earth orbital mission. Yet the manager of the Apollo Spacecraft Project Office, George M. Lowe, had another idea in mind. He envisioned Apollo 8 being something bigger than an Earth orbital mission after the massive success of Apollo 7. Almost single-handedly, Lowe convinced NASA to make Apollo 8 a lunar orbital mission. This decision would eventually be one of the most important resolutions in the history of the Apollo missions and would bring Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders closer to the moon than any other human has been. On December 21st, 1968, after some slight revisions to their Saturn V design, Apollo 8 started its journey to the moon. They intended to test the equipment and observe the surface of the moon while in lunar orbit, and roughly 68 hours after takeoff, with the help of mission control and the near-perfect piloting of the three men, the astronauts came into orbit around the moon for the first time in human history. Here they could see up close the surface of the moon. Anders described the moon as follows on the Christmas Eve television broadcast.
I hope that all of you back on Earth can see what we mean when we say it's a rather foreboding horizon, a rather stark and unappetizing looking place.
As they came around the front of the moon, they saw all of planet Earth in front of their own eyes. Everyone they knew and would ever know were living their lives on that little dot, 200,000 miles away. After adjusting the spacecraft, the crew headed home to an optimistic America. With the help of these breathtaking photographs taken on Apollo 8, the American people were eager to see what NASA had to offer next. Confident with their abilities, NASA was ready to launch the final two missions before the moon landing. First, Apollo 9, a manned Earth orbital mission to test the new lunar module and safety equipment created for the landing. And second, Apollo 10, a manned lunar orbital mission to collect and refine data on the moon's gravitational field and other necessary information for the landing. There were no major complications with either mission and proved once again that NASA could very easily get to the moon.
NASA was now prepared to finally fulfill President John F. Kennedy's promise to the country and land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. The world was ecstatic to see if America could do the one thing no one had ever done before. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were the flight crew on Apollo 11, and they were extensively trained on the handling of the spacecraft and all flight procedures. In short, they were the best men for the job. As NASA worked tirelessly on last-minute preparations, all of the members of the flight crew were preparing for the worst, yet hoping for the best. On July 16, 1969, the three astronauts finally embarked on the mission of a lifetime. Tension mounted as each stage of the rocket was successfully executed. Every news station was covering the live feed from the astronauts. Children were taken out of school to watch this historic moment on their televisions. 600 million people were there as the shuttle exited Earth's orbit. 600 million people were there as the lunar module entered lunar orbit. And 600 million people were there when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed the lunar module and took their famous first steps on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Homes of Americans erupted with cheer for these brave men as they walked across the lunar surface. They spent around 20 hours on the moon's surface, collecting samples and examining the terrain. Many photographs were taken that would become immortalized by history. The noble pursuits of the entire country brought these men here, and they were excited to be there. Eventually, though, their celebrations on the moon had to come to an end, and they needed to return to Earth. The entire mission lasted a total of 8 days, and on July 24th, they had successfully entered Earth's atmosphere and touched down in the Pacific Ocean. The astronauts came home to a hero's welcome. This event brought about a renaissance of space exploration for the world by bringing these men to the moon. The hard work of the engineers and scientists that worked on all of the Apollo missions had finally paid off. With Apollo 11, America had finally fulfilled JFK's promise and declared technological supremacy over the world for years to come. Thanks to these Apollo missions, America, and most importantly the world, was one step closer to unlocking the secrets of our solar system.